can go ahead and introduce themselves and what they do, and then we can get started. And we'll start here on the left.
Starting with me?
Yes.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Ty Tifono Chose. I am a current commissioner for the Washington Commission on Asian and Pacific American Affairs. I'm in my 9th year serving the commission. I'll be retiring at the end of this month, and I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
My name's Dave Keenan. I'm a King County Superior Court judge. I serve on the statewide Access to Justice Board, which mostly works on civil legal aid for low-income people, and on the board of Choose 180, which works to keep young people and young adults out of the justice system.
My name is Minty Longearth, and I'm here in the capacity of serving for HOIC, which is the legal body that protects the rights of Indigenous people impacted by incarceration nationwide, but specifically in Washington State. And I'm the co-host of Breakdances with Wolves Indigenous Pirate Radio.
Hi, I'm Tanya Erzin. I'm a professor at the University of Puget Sound and one of the founders with a group of women in the prison of the Freedom Education Project Puget Sound. And we do associate's degree for women in prison, and we're about to start a bachelor's degree.
Hello, everyone. My name is Damian Davis, no one else. I am an attorney, and what I do is I represent young folks who are incarcerated in the kid prisons throughout the state.
And just before we get started, we did want to, just take a moment to recognize that it is Juneteenth, which was June 19th, 1865, when emancipation from slavery, the ending of slavery. So we do want to take a moment to celebrate that and just think about the history behind that. And so for our first question we have is, how accessible is education in prisons for all inmates? And what are the barriers to access? If anyone wants to go ahead and shoot.
I'll start. Okay. So I currently volunteer at Monroe Prison, and I'm a sponsor both at Monroe and at Airway Heights in Spokane. But my main focus has been on the API groups, creating cultural groups within. With this involvement, I've come across other volunteers at both institutions who are involved in teaching courses through University Beyond Bars, which is something similar to what she's created with Purdy. I know for sure that the UBB program out of Monroe has been quite successful. The incarcerated persons there have taken advantage of the courses there to get GEDs, high school diplomas and stuff. But I feel like some of the barriers with the classes offered are they don't get a good sense of who they are, because these classes only have to do with what's required to get a high school education. There's no sociology or anything like that. They can't practice cultural identity, things in that realm. So, it's accessible to get educated in there, but there's still a hindrance on what's offered, the courses that are offered.
And if I could just follow up on the barriers, one huge barrier to accessing education in prison is just getting those who are incarcerated ready to learn because of the trauma that they've experienced in the years leading up to a period of incarceration and the further traumatization that they experience as a result of being incarcerated. So as a judge, I don't order people into a particular education program when I send them to prison, and though often the people that I'm sentencing, and I have a sentencing calendar every afternoon from 1 to 4, you're welcome to come by and observe, are struggling with mental illness, they're struggling with chemical dependency, they've been traumatized, they've been victimized, exploited, abused, and they will get precious little treatment for that, if any, in prison. Unless I sentence somebody to a drug offender sentencing alternative sentencing regime, they won't even get drug treatment. At best, they might be able to attend AA or NA, and they won't get any mental health treatment at all. So getting those folks even ready to learn, and I think it's useful to think about school discipline, think about school-age children who are acting out in school because of childhood trauma, because of things going on at home. Imagine how much more difficult it would be by the time you got to prison. So I think that's another barrier.
And I want to acknowledge that we're on the unceded territories of the Duwamish people, the original caregivers here on this land. So I thank them for allowing us to be here today. I think that the same disparities that you see that are impacting Indigenous people in education outside of the Iron House is exactly what is reflected inside. So even now where you have arguable numbers and very flawed data collection around our education for Indigenous people, only 5% of us outside are getting our degrees that are masters and higher, 5%. So inside you have all of these barriers, including the fact that this is one group whose languages of 500 plus nations have been ripped from us. And so the very basics that a lot of people who are living in these iron houses is, can we just learn our language? Can we just get permission to have CDs and learn our language? If we could just start there, if we could decolonize the basic process of ABCs for us, if we could actually look at the ability for handling education in a decolonized way that works for a lot of Indigenous people. Most of us are tactile learners. And so allowing somebody to bead while they're trying to study is really, really helpful. And yet it is not a practice that is acceptable because it doesn't look like westernized studying, right? So the other impacts that you'll see is that somebody who's got a long bid oftentimes will not be allowed to get an education. Why would you put money behind somebody that you think is not going to ever use it, right? And then you have all these other politics that go on, politricks that go on. And then if you are 1 to 2% of the population outside, but you're anywhere from 5 to 9% of the population in there, and you are looking at these education programs, much of these education programs do not speak to Indigenous people at all. And then when they do, again, the numbers being so low, there's a lot of fear about going into a program where you don't have anybody that's got your back and you don't have anybody that's from your circle, your hoop, coming in there. The Indigenous folks also don't usually make a distinction between us and our Pacific Islander brothers and sisters inside. So we end up working together to try and find ways to self-educate inside.
The other barrier that's been the case in Washington is that there was no public funding, state funding allowed for college and prison until this year. So last year, that ban was removed. They could pay for workforce AAs. This year, they just removed that restriction, that workforce language. So the community colleges get millions of dollars from the State Department of Corrections to do programs inside each of the prisons. But until this year, they weren't allowed to offer college. So University Beyond Bars that she mentioned, or what we do, since we raise all of our own money, we came in because we were asked by a group of women, multiracial, all age group, who wanted college and had heard that men were accessing that actually at Monroe, and we put those students in contact with each other. But we have been the problem with education is that the barrier is that you often aren't allowed to participate in not just education, but other programs if you have a long sentence, especially if you're over 7 years. So for instance, an 18-year-old just got sentenced to 40 years at the women's prison, and really she can do GED, but that the state is required to do GED, but cannot access another education program. So what we were trying to do was offer both credit-bearing and non-credit-bearing classes to people so that they could have access. But that's why we weren't taking state funding. I think the interesting piece of that too, and UBB also does this, and FEPS does this, is offering classes that are not accredited so that people can take things as an entree into the program and get over that barrier, especially people who haven't been in school. Because another barrier is, and I speak more for women, transgender, nonconforming people in the prison where we work, is not being in school for a long time, being told you were bad at school, never having college as an idea that something you could do. So there's a lot of those kinds of barriers that people get through. So we do non-credited program classes, we do pre-college, math and English, because I think the worst thing you can do is stick someone in a class that they're not prepared for, because we want people to succeed. We have also a group of women that are the leaders in our program and make program decisions on the inside. And so those who've been through the program can mentor those coming in, and that's been really effective. But I think the barriers are changing, and they're reauthorizing federal funding for Pell. And people have said that's a good thing because it opens up money so people can go to college and prison like they used to before 1994. But the issue then is you also have private places like Ashland University and private colleges who see people inside prisons as basically a captive market, where you can actually force people to pay for really low quality education. And I think one thing that's important to me and our program, and I think very much to our students, is that excellence and equity are things that we hold together, that to make sure that people inside are getting access to what people would have on the outside. Obviously there are constraints, but so many programs in prison teach to the prison and assume certain things about people are in prison. And so that's, I think, an important value to think about in any kind of program.
I'm glad you mentioned that whole captive audience dynamic, because I see it a lot in the juvenile prisons in this state, where you don't have UBB, you don't really have the same kind of opportunities for higher ed, and the ones that you do have are paid, and they're paid out of pocket by the young folks there who only earn money through prison labor. So I'm glad you mentioned that. That's going on in the juvenile prisons too, and it's the only game in town right now. The unique thing about the juvenile prisons, and I think everyone's aware, that in our state, young folks have a right to education. That doesn't change when they go into a juvenile prison. The problem is that right now, and for this summer and for next year, I think we're going to see these prison schools get even worse because of the fallout from the McCleary decision. There's almost no funding. One example for this is Echo Glen Children's Center, which is a prison just in our backyard in Snoqualmie, where they will be looking at moving to one teacher for approximately 150 to 200 kids there. So that's what the school looks like. And oftentimes you do have young folks who are living with very traumatic experiences in their communities and in their schools, who are excluded for discipline, for cultural differences, whatever it is. And that, of course, just gets verified in these pretty lackluster prison schools. So unique barriers to young folks. And young folks, for us in Washington State, doesn't just mean really young folks. The age range was increased this legislative session to include young folks up to 25 years of age. We're talking about 11 to 25. This is a lot of people. I think that's all I have to say.
Could I just add that another global barrier is the attitude outside of prison, and the attitude in the community that prisoners are disposable and that they will never come back to the community and therefore don't deserve any benefits, what they consider benefits or any humane treatment at all, frankly, while they're incarcerated. And 95% of the people that I sentence to prison will return to the community at some point. But to hear, I think, a lot of folks in society talk about it as if you're never going to see them again. And the question I always ask is, if 95% of the people I'm sending to prison are going to come back, what would you like? What condition do you want them in when you come back? And so until we get past that mindset, it's going to be very difficult to get funding. And it took a long time to get funding for what we have now, but we need a lot more.
So, kind of added to that question, are there racial disparities in the access to education in prisons?
Ooh, do not get us started. Go for it.
Next question.
I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah.
I'll just leave it at that. I think Mitty would be good at answering this one for all of us.
The disparities are, again, reflective of what happens outside, but it's much more magnified and it's much more in your face. And it's real interesting to, you move in and out of being out here and then going inside. And folks like us that do that work, sometimes you're in there for 4 or 5 days or whatever, you will find yourself getting institutionalized really quick working in there, right? But to listen to people who are making profound decisions about people's life, narrow it down to these tropes, to these amazing ignorant stereotypes that are 100 years delayed, 50 years behind us. And these are people who are getting paid the big bucks to make these decisions. There is the microaggressions all the time, but there's also internalized oppression that's really, really deep. And so you do tend to have the 10 people who start to do better, get all the attention, get all the love, get all of the backing. And the folks who, like we've said, are struggling with trauma and still able to hold a conversation and get a book should be the ones that we're really trying to uplift and to give some attention. And oftentimes the race disparity comes down to the race disparity. I can tell you many times where I will watch an offender who is white presenting, and I'm using the word offender only because that's what the general term outside is. But when I say relative, a lot of people that are outside are like, oh, you're related to them. That's what we call people who live inside, right? So our relatives that live there, if they're white presenting, can get, written up several times, can have all kinds of issues, and will still be given chance after chance after chance after chance. And the volunteers who are white will get chance after chance after chance to make a simple mistake. Somebody that is of color can walk in as a volunteer and forget they had gum in their pocket, get walked off, get, all kinds of problems, have to go through all this stuff where I've sat around and gone, I'm going off of a tangent, but I've gone into, we have PREA training, Prison Rape Elimination Act, right? Now it's online, but when I started, you had to go through actual training in person, which I still think should happen. And you would see people who were white, who were volunteering in these programs, having to go through PREA multiple times for poor or questionable behavior. Let one brown person hug too long when you see somebody at a family day and all of a sudden, your badge is pulled, everything's a big deal. So on top of the way that the family that lives there is treated, there's also their support system that's treated with that same kind of issues. And the racial tropes that go with the mothers that come in and the fathers that come in to visit their family continue. You will see people immediately put into, oh, that's the welfare mom. That's the hood rat. That's the, all of these kind of things. And yet you don't see that with a lot of the white presenting folks. So it becomes one of those things where you go, here we go. I know I need to put my hair back. I know I need to speak this way instead of speaking the way I speak at home. I need to downplay, I will literally have white counterparts who will go, downplay the ethnic jewelry, okay? Just play that way down. Don't wear your hoops. Don't do that. Maybe put your hair back, and these are my white counterparts who have already figured out that, they listen to what is said when I'm walking out the door too. So yeah, race is a big problem in the prisons. But I'm curious how it plays out in youth prisons.
I didn't know I was going to be on this panel today, so I didn't pull any statistics. So the only thing I have to say about it right now is to echo what Minty shared during the first question, which is that both prison and the education system are sites of cultural warfare, genocide, and exclusion. This curriculum that we share with our students is a white-dominated, white supremacist message. Folks who aren't from that or don't fit into that narrative often have a hard time accepting it and learning it because they don't see themselves in it. So that's a global access to education that happens just as much as it does in the prison as it does outside of the prison. That's my sneaky answer.
We do see also with the women that, women of color are disproportionately represented in the prison population. I'm from the East Coast. The prisons in New York look really different than they do here in terms of racial makeup. But you see over time, women of color have their sentences are longer. I'm not an expert on sentencing, although I certainly looked at it and taught it. But the students who have the longest sentences, who would be more drawn to a program where they can participate. It doesn't matter what their crime is, how long they're in there. tend to be more women of color. And I think so that just sort of reflects the disparities in sentencing and who gets long sentences. And there are also white women that get long sentences in the prison as well. And I would say, just to echo what you're saying, I think higher education has a problem with racism on the outside. And so the big thing with professors, who has a PhD, who has the time and ability to go into a prison, the privilege to take time from their regular job to teach a class for very little pay, because most colleges don't count teaching inside a prison as part of your normal job. So faculty of color are underrepresented on campuses. They're a smaller percentage. And then to expect then, okay, you should then teach in a prison too. It's also that racial disparity is in both places. And I think it just reflects the problems, like you're saying, with higher education on the outside. I will say though, that the students, it was really important to them to get credits, to get the degree, to have college classes that are accredited. So yes, education is created, by certain people to reflect certain values. And at the same time, students want that degree because it gives people power, it gives people cultural capital. So I think that's the tension, that's the problem. I think we need reform on the outside and in the inside. I get really upset though when someone says, well, I'm just going to teach this class. I actually never teach it on the outside. I'm a psychologist, but I think I'm going to dabble in chemistry because people are in prison, so I might as well experiment on them. And people do have that attitude. Professors have that attitude, and I think that's really important too, that treating people as students in an equitable manner who have the same rigor, the same expectations, the same curriculum, the same classes you would do on the outside, that's really important. And I see that happening in a lot of places. So.
All right, question for you, Judge Davis, is what is the role of a judge in the education system in prisons?
Well, the short answer is almost none. And really that's unfortunate. But I mean, I think there are a couple of different ways to look at it. So something I was getting at earlier is when I sentence somebody to prison, I don't impose a condition, for example, that they earn their GED while they are incarcerated. And nobody ever requests that. The defense counsel doesn't request that. The prosecutors don't request that. I certainly don't order that they obtain a college education. What I will often order is some sort of class related to whatever the sentence was. So, for example, with domestic violence, it might be a course called Thinking for a Change or Moral Recognition Therapy. These are things to try and help folks deal with trauma and with violence and their tendencies towards violence. But I don't order any kind of education. And on the one hand, I think, and I've seen judges in other jurisdictions do this, say, I'm going to order that you get your degree while you're in prison or whatever. It sounds nice, but what am I doing? I'm imposing a condition on them, right? And that's a problem because until they complete that condition of their sentence, they're not out from underneath their sentence. So as good as it might make me feel for a moment to say, I think you're great, you have so much potential, and I'm going to order that you get your degree while in prison, what I'm doing is just imposing one more thing on them. And my goal as a judge is to get folks through, if I can, and to either help them avoid being tethered to the criminal justice system in the first instance, or if I'm going to send them to prison, for their involvement with the criminal justice system to be as short as possible. I want people to be able to complete their sentences and move on with their lives. So really don't have a role when it comes to education. I go and speak in the community a lot about the school to prison pipeline, or what I call the birth to prison machine, but I don't have any direct involvement.
So I read an article a little while ago about how free books in prisons were going to be a banned situation here, but then after, I believe, a ton of signatures, they brought it back. I guess my one question is for us is, one, do any of you guys have any more information on why they initially banned those books? And then also, with getting the access to books back, are there a lot of, what's the word, just like access issues or more rules, regulations involved with that? And, yeah.
God, I hope nobody from the DOC is watching this answer right now, but here it goes. Oh, great. Let me self-edit. Oftentimes in the DOC, somebody on whatever you want to call the middle level will make some random decision that will impact people. And the reason that I do the work I'm doing is because some random person in the middle section decided that they knew better than anybody what Native people should and shouldn't do. And they tried to outlaw sacred practices, and they didn't inform anybody. And so when a practitioner was there doing their work with the hoop, they were suddenly grabbed and said, you have tobacco, you have illegal contraband. And surprisingly, that person, whose name is Wakadip Munger, Wakadip said, oh, then I'm not leaving. How about that? Make me leave the prison. And he absolutely refused to leave Monroe. And it was tripping everybody out because they were calling the lawyers going, this dude is literally willing to be arrested to stay here. And so they ended up calling Gabe Galanda. Gabe Galanda is one of those lawyers, I tell you, like, he's the best friend you want to have if he's your friend. If he's not your friend, that is the scariest opponent ever, because he will do whatever he's got to do to get that point. And he went in and they fought hard. And the DOC realized that they were directly in violation of the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. Unfortunately, most people who are not Native don't even know what ERFA is. So they had no idea that they were violating this law and its subsequent amendments. But the small handful of Native activists that did know it went in, and with the help of the communities that are indigenous, that include Pacific Islander communities, we were able to get them to reverse that decision and surprisingly apologize, actually make an apology. We were shocked. That's how this whole kind of system changed, and we went back to what we were supposed to be doing. However, since then, things like removing arts and crafts, things like removing specific classes, learning opportunities, things like that, they happen at some mid-level, and then that person is no longer in that position anymore, and then it changes. Now with the books, that was some shady shit that went down. And for a lot of us who have served, who have been the descendants of people who have only been able to legally read for the last few generations, I wanted to punch everybody's throats. I was so offended. And what you were watching was the recalibration of a system in real time. So when you hear people who talk about, look, this system was designed exactly for what it is doing. This system is working perfectly. This system is not broke. It is not bothered. This system will look at it, start to change, and it will just recalibrate. And that's what happened with the books at mid-level. And it didn't even take as much work as you think it did. It didn't take thousands and thousands of signatures. It took people like us calling over to headquarters and going, now, you know, I'm about to bring some fire and smoke of which you are not prepared for. And those names will include Van Jones and Michelle Alexander and Roxanne Gay, because they're sitting on this subject. And everybody went, wait, calm down, here. And right now, that same middle level has their own little email thread going around, and they're all whining about, you know, they're getting their books back, they're taking our jabs, and they're doing this on email. And I'm telling you that there are different places, different facilities that are still struggling with the book issue, because some mid-level person is going, I didn't get your memo. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just going to pretend I didn't get the memo. And this will go on for months until somebody sues the shit out of them, or they get threatened with the suit. And then it's so funny to see how quickly those mid-level people have, and if there's anyone in here that's mid-level, I apologize. We can meet out in the hallway. But it's usually that level that's going to dig in their heels. And it tends not to be the highest level, and it tends not to be the people on the ground doing the work. Been holding on to that for a while.
It's just so arbitrary too, because they came up with that. The rule before that was you couldn't bring used books in. You could only send new books, which for a group like Books to Prisoners, or for anyone who wants to donate books or try and build a library, especially, you know, if you're doing academic work, getting access to research is really hard inside, which is a whole separate issue. That, you know, then to suddenly just blanket withdraw them. But I think like you're saying, it's the pressure, the national pressure. And then always with these rules, you know, we were told at WCCW, it's fine, just keep bringing books. Don't worry about it. So there's these sort of rules that come down, and then they're arbitrarily enforced. and they're enforced for some people and not for other people, like you mentioned before. And navigating that, it is crazy making, and the system is working the way it was designed. And I think all of thinking about education in prison, we always say the job should be to put ourselves out of business, because, you know, ideally there wouldn't be a need for education programs in prison, because we wouldn't be sending so many people to prison in the first place. There are just too many people in there that are being sent there that shouldn't be there. And prison is not the place that people should be getting an education. I always struggle with that video, and Rosa saying, my kids want me to stay and not go out on a DOSA so I can be with them because I'm going to get an education in prison, which I think is nuts. I mean, we should be pushing for freedom for people not being in those spaces. It's not a place to get mental health treatment. It's not a space to deal with trauma. It's just re-traumatizing. And I really believe that that's what we should be working towards, and certainly not building new prisons for young people. We should be trying to eradicate prisons as a solution, because they don't work. They don't work. And the people, but they are designed there to keep perpetuating themselves. So, and our program participates in that, because we run a program in a prison, and that's that is another tension.
I have a shameless pitch on that theme, if you'll allow me, Raynika. Thank you. And I'm going to need your help for it too. So in the juvenile prisons, it's a little more difficult to get books because they have to be vetted. And the only way that you can get them is still new in the juvenile prisons is through family contacts. But there is a workaround, and I hate to do this, but I'm going to shout out an Amazon wish list. So some of the librarians at these facilities have created these Amazon wish lists, and they collect requests from these young folks themselves, residents in these facilities, who can request specific books that they'd like to read. They go on this Amazon list, and anyone can buy them anonymously. And if I get you those links, can you post those for these folks?
Yes. Absolutely. So, I think Tanya, you had touched on this a little bit earlier in the conversation, but is there a variation between the education programs with women and men and women prisons? I know you had said that Monroe had a program that some of the women prisons didn't have, and that you guys were getting those.
Yeah, so in Monroe, University Beyond Bars, which there's a person here that's, Cami is an expert on this too, but really it was developed by the Black Prisoners Caucus and by people inside. They were doing distance learning, and then Dr. Gilda Shepard, who's a professor, was teaching at the women's prison. And it was a group of women there who had formed a community-based organization to say, we hear men are getting accredited classes. They were through a distance learning model, but taught in person. And what can we do? What can we have here? So now there is a program in the women's prison, and there are programs that the BPC Teach has created in other places, different models. But then there's also this whole other model of the corrections education programs that get money from the state that the community colleges do. And sometimes those programs are in tension, because the community college programs have money and resources. They're community college, but they're also DOC employees. They're trained as officers. They go through the same training. I think that the people that teach in them, and I'm sorry if there's people here, but I really don't think that you should always teach in a prison. I think it's really good not to always be in a prison, and not to have that be, you were talking about institutionalization, but people who teach, and that's their job over and over, and their job is dependent on enough people filling their classes. It's a recipe for disaster. You're not really doing education to me at that point. So I think that's another difference, prison to prison, what kind of programs are offered. It would be really terrific if people in prison, different prisons doing education, were allowed to talk to each other, because they could share, hey, we're doing this is happening here. I know the API group is now coming to the women's prison. There's just so many possibilities for collaboration, but it's not supposed to happen legally. There's a consortium on higher ed in Washington State, and I have said, well, if DOC members DOC people are members of this group, can't you change the policy so that we could have meetings and people could Skype in, or we could have it at a prison and other people from other prisons could talk to each other? Because I think also outside people tend to mess things up for the people inside often. And so there is that difference. And I think there's differences, just gender stuff, between having talked to the the Prisoner Advisory Council at Monroe, since the beginning, there's just different things that that the women are dealing with. Now there are more and more trans men in the Washington Correction Center for women. Their way of dealing, and a lot of them are in the program. And I think there's just, and not to say that's not true, but how do you sort of think about gender? How do you think about race? There's differences in both of those as well.
Also, we were able to talk with one another for years and years. That only stopped in the last 8 years. University Beyond Bars has actually decolonized their leadership model, and it's been really interesting for us to watch it happen. I was one of the people who was like, that is a terrible idea. We're all going to die, but that's pretty much me half the time. And then I sat with Margaret and Joel and really listened and went in and talked to the bros and really listened to the idea behind it and the way, how much thought was put into it. And now I'm a huge fan. I really, really like the idea. I think everything takes tweaking, of course, but this is, to be honest, if any of us who have organizations that are led by people of color had tried that, it wouldn't have happened. So if it takes us to be like, yay, UBB, do it, fine with us. But we also have held UBB accountable in the last year. We have had hard conversations about a lot of what went down between our programs and UBB. And I appreciate that they have been willing to have those conversations and have sought out having those conversations and making some amends about the way that things have played out over the last years.
Are you all working in the women's prison?
Yeah, we work in all 12 facilities. Yeah.
The folks who identify as female in the juvenile prisons are facing a really unique situation right now. It kind of boils down to a numbers game. There isn't a large enough population to have a specific facility for folks who identify as female in the juvenile system. So they live in a prison mostly for boys. And the statistics are, at any given time, you have about 600 young folks who are incarcerated in the juvenile system, and they only have capacity for 50 folks who identify as female. We're talking 550 to 50. The statistic is way off, and as a result, so are the services. So about a year and a half ago, here at Echo Glen, which is the facility that houses folks who identify as female, they decided to segregate the education, pull the girls from the general campus into their own. But because of those numbers, and because I've already explained that there's at maximum 3 teachers for the whole campus, they don't have access that's as great as the folks who identify as male in those facilities. And that results in things that you might expect, things like they don't have access to appropriate classes, because we all know that you're supposed to take algebra and then you take, geometry. I was never good at any of that, but they might not have that offered for them. So it has right now a big problem, and folks are watching out for that and trying to do something about it. But it's also tough because, at least the way that I work and a lot of people doing this juvenile work, we believe in listening to the young folks and what they want. And some of the girls want to have segregated education, and trying to then also open up kind of a type of equity for them is much more difficult than bringing them back into the Gen Pop.
So once an inmate is released from prison or juvenile, how are they prepared to succeed? And I guess is if they did go through any of these education programs, do they have mentors or people that they can reach out to once they're out to find either more schooling, work access, job readiness, anything like that?
Can I just start that? So are any of our people from FIGHT here or Parasol? Credible Messengers? Because I don't want to take your space if you're here. All right, but I got to mention them because those 3 organizations are very vital to re-entry work, especially for prisoners of color. if they're part of general population and they get involved in the groups that start to form inside and the cultural groups that are starting to form, then they'll know where to go and what to expect when they, when they're released back into population. And it's because these three organizations, FIGHT, for instance, the acronym for FIGHT is Formerly Incarcerated Group Healing Together. They're all formerly incarcerated people, that did the work inside, and then they carry it outside and they continue to work. Parasol as well, who is a Pacific Rim, I forgot what the whole stance is for that, but they concentrate on like some of the Asian population that falls through the cracks, like our Southeast Asians, and then Credible Messengers focuses on youth, and they try to touch base with youth that are getting ready to be released so that they can get them into get them under their wings and start to push them forward in a positive direction. I wish those three groups were here. I don't know how long this group has been in existence. I was quite taken aback that this group was not connected with those three groups I just mentioned. But hopefully, moving forward, we all come together in that sense, because I think that they're what they can offer this group of people and alongside the panel here is a very, very profound work that they do with the reentry, the reentry of these people. So just want to give them a shout out. Yep. FIGHT, Parasol, Credible Messengers. Great work.
And I'll add, I'll add a group to that list, and that's Civil Survival. And I don't know if any of you have heard of Civil Survival.
Yes.
Civil Survival is led by a woman named Amanda Dubois, who's an attorney, probably their sort of rock star, the person that is out in front on most of their issues is a woman named Tara Simmons.
Yes.
Some of you may have heard of her. Was incarcerated at WCCW. Eventually earned her law degree, was denied the opportunity to sit for the bar exam, eventually won that through the state Supreme Court, is now a licensed attorney. And Civil Survival does a couple of things. Well, they do a lot of things, but they do two things in particular. One is that they help prisoners coming out of prison navigate their civil legal needs, and that's something that I work on a lot. I used to be the president of the board at Northwest Justice Project, the largest civil legal aid provider in Washington, and that is helping those who've been incarcerated with access to employment, housing, credit, healthcare, things like that, all the civil legal needs for which they won't get any state-provided legal assistance. And Tara does that, helping prisoners navigate that, the organization does. But also, Civil Survival is really working to try and mobilize people who are formerly incarcerated politically. And so you see them out front a lot. For example, I just came from the Access to Justice conference in Spokane over the weekend, and you had folks there talking about legal financial obligations and how even when you've done your time, I think there's an organization called I Did the Time. In fact, even when you've done your time, you might be making payments on your civil legal obligations for decades and never get out from under that, no matter how successful and educated you become otherwise.
Throwing out names, Black Prisoners Caucus, it's a foundation.
Right.
A lot of this work you guys are speaking about, so something to look into if you are not aware of that.
Okay, thank you.
Right now, today at UW Tacoma, there's actually a reentry education summit happening. Civil Survival's there, Project Rebound they brought from California, which is a pretty amazing model, started by someone who's formerly incarcerated. The Underground Scholars Initiative, which is a group of formerly incarcerated people that started at UC Berkeley and have this model that they're building all over California, Danny Murillo. And someone, Tara Simmons, who's speaking at our graduation this Saturday at the prison. Amanda's on our board. Tara's sister, who is also involved in the juveniles in the system as a juvenile, is the person who works for us as a Pathways program person and helps people figure out. So you're getting out, what's your plan, connecting them to the resources on campus and so forth. But I would urge you to look at the groups that are at UWT, because I think other states are doing really, Washington's great, but I think it's really good to look at other models, and Rebound and the Underground Scholars have done really terrific work. So it's happening now.
And my favorite model nationwide is the Center for New Leadership on Urban Solutions. specifically the work that is being done by Corey Green and Chino Harden. Corey Green runs How Our Lives Link All Together, HALA. And it was founded by people who were previously incarcerated, and it has become what is now a nationwide model on restoration. And if you're familiar with the documentaries 13th or Time Khalif Browder story, you've seen KJ Ree and Corey Green throughout those documentaries.
I think just a barrier at campuses still here. UW-T is doing a lot of great work, and there's a lot of good people there, but there's still a lot of barriers for people leaving these programs and going onto campus. So even where I teach, they still, up until this year, were requiring that you write an essay about why you were in prison. UW Seattle still has sort of issues around checking the box. There's a national campaign to ban the box, but until campuses, it's not just that structural piece, but also having people there who've actually experienced what you've experienced, because no one wants to be on campus and feel marginalized. And I think UW-T, Evergreen, Tacoma has done a great job of building those support systems, but a lot of places here have a long way to go.
May I also add that the faith-based, the faith leaders are also very heavily into the reentry work. I wanted to introduce everybody to Dale here, who has been, you've been volunteering at Monroe over 20 years now, Dale?
No.
About how long?
I started at Clallam Bay.
At Clallam Bay, right.
Yeah, I forgot when that was, 2005 or something.
Mhm.
And at Monroe since about 2012. So
Gotcha.
7 years.
Okay, I wanted to give you space because part of the new work that Dale and his group are doing is working with the sex offenders at Monroe. This is a throwaway population of prisoners who nobody wants to work with, and they don't get resources or get to develop groups and all that stuff like everybody else in general pop. And Dale and his group have recently started working with that particular unit and started building new hope in them. And could you just speak a little bit about the work and what you're seeing with that, Dale?
I would say two things. One is the sex offenders actually at TR, the Twin Rivers unit.
Twin Rivers, yes,
I'm more
thank you.
in the SRU, which is
Mhm.
men struggling with mental illness. Neither one of them has a lot of a volunteer education going on, and only the state mandated stuff.
Can you talk louder, please?
Okay, so what we do in the special capacity unit is a very simple program. We have a team of 12 who visit twice a month with inmates who have long sentences and who have no visitors on their authorized visitor list. So they may have been in the SRU for 12 years and never had visitors. And so we come in and just socialize. It's not an education program, it's just friendships. And my wife and I have visited the same two men for 2 years now. Some men drop out of the program, and men are added. We're trying to expand that program. But according to the prison, which I was stunned to hear, there are less incidents of violence in the SIU. There's less use of what they call closed observation, which means a person in danger of harming themselves. And they attribute it all to this, just that people are coming in and visiting with men who get no visitors. And somehow that seems to raise the esteem of all the men of the SRU, whether or not they actually are in the program. They know people who aren't getting paid to do it. Just come and respect them as human beings. So that's a really simple program. We're trying to expand it. There's something like 20 people on a waiting list. And we're trying to expand it to the intensive management unit, which we've been invited to do, but right now we don't have the capacity to do that. So. And then the other program I'm involved with, which is really getting exciting, used to be called the Hispanic Culture Group at the WSR unit. They're transforming themselves into the Latino Development Organization. with a focus on opportunity for education in Spanish as well as in English. As far as I know, there's very little Spanish language education in the prison system, which is, it's odd given that I think Spanish is the second most spoken language in the country and in prisons. So we're working with the Mexican government, a program called Plazas Comunitaria, which is 3rd to 9th grade education. And we're getting that into Monroe this fall, we believe. And the Mexican government actually gives diplomas for 6th and 9th grade levels. So if we're deported back to Mexico or to Central America, those diplomas can be helpful. And we're also sponsoring a theater arts program. And that would be open to anyone, but in Spanish and English. And have several other things. And the focus is on certificate education, not on college level. You don't have to be college level to enter any level. And that's actually quite exciting because it's driven by the men themselves. I mean, we're starting a nonprofit group to support them, but in the bylaws of the nonprofit, it's a memorandum of understanding with the men in prison that basically says you run it, we do what you say. So, and that's partly because of the previous experience with the Black Prisoners Caucus and having their program taken away from them before they got that.
Thanks, Gail.
But I do think not speaking English is a barrier to education in prison. We're not speaking it well is a barrier to education.
Well, the reason why I wanted to highlight your work is because the other thing that we need to be aware of is that the sex offender unit is not receiving UBB. They don't get to participate in that, but yet they're more likely to get released back into society. And then when they're released, it's sensationalized with neighborhoods and all that. So it's very important that work starts there. And even though that's a minor just a little capacity of work to help with those men, something's starting, but there's so much more is needed.
So much harder.
So much more is needed. And all these organizations we all mentioned, it's all volunteer based. There's no funding behind it. And half the time they can't even get public support. Because when you say prisoners, people back off. Corporations, organizations, they don't want anything to do with it. So it just makes our work so much more harder.
And there's a gender disparity because you will find that people will respond, they'll at least listen to you when you're talking about doing work in what's
so
considered
true.
a cisgendered men's facility.
Yes.
And I have had conversations with those same leaders and said, women's facilities don't have it, and had them cut me off and go,
Shut down.
I'm not helping those women, terrible moms. And we're going, wait a minute, so those aren't terrible dads, but these are terrible moms. These are your sisters. These are your friends. These, and 90% of the women in there have had traumatic injuries to them that have been abuse related. And we don't have any love for them. And they're coming home. Like, that's the problem for me. But it's real specific. People who have male family members and will go visit them and won't go visit the women that they're related to in the prisons.
So true. Thank you.
Many of you know anything about immigration polls and their effect on access to education?
I don't know how that affects, so someone, for example, who might not have lawful status in the United States and is incarcerated and has an immigration hold on them, in other words, when their term is completed, they'll be turned over to ICE rather than released back into the community. I don't know if that prevents them from accessing education in
I
prison.
know it used to. It was years ago.
I don't know if one of the other panelists knows.
If the program is state funded, at least where we are, then yes. But we have people who are not considered to be citizens of the U.S. but who do participate in our program because we don't take money from the state. But I do think there's a huge problem, like you're saying, that people who can't access education because of the language barrier too. So there's a whole program. Students who learn Spanish and work with students who are so that they can participate in college as well. That's through this organization called The Village that was created by women in the prison for each other.
So I want to take this opportunity to open up questions for audience members. If anyone has any questions for our panelists.
I have a couple.
Yeah.
But my first question is really around technical education. So is there any courses offered to be able to earn not just a college degree, but maybe thinking more about like technical certificates for like plumbers or electricians, programs like that? Is there any work being done to support those kinds of programs in the group?
The trades.
There's the track program, which helps in the women's prison, and do you know where else the track program is that does so people can leave and be and get in the trades and get a union position. It's fairly small. So there's also an organization called Unloop that's led by Gina Castillo, and they do computer science education inside and then help people with internships on the outside. But it just in Washington, the state funding, a lot of them have gone to vocational programs. So it depends prison to prison. But the other problem is, and sometimes people have been trained in things on the inside that actually the outside campus doesn't have, or that they're not able to actually get jobs in because of different kinds of licensing barriers. So they're starting to be better at thinking about that. But why would you train someone to do something that then when they get out, they actually can't do because no one will give them a license for it? So there's been issues with cosmetology. People do Braille translation at the women's prison, which is really considered a good job there. It's well paid, but very few people actually can be placed. There's one place in Kentucky but a lot of people don't want to be sent to Kentucky to do Braille translation. Similar programs. So designing different kinds of workforce and hybrid workforce education programs that actually then transfer to the outside into careers, not just jobs, because people want, what I think most people want is meaningful work and meaningful lives. And a lot of the way that I see those programs being designed was like for prisoners, right? We're going to pigeonhole it. You can pick this one thing. And I think we should be giving people the choice to decide what is it that you care about? What is it that you want to do? What can we do to help you build a full, meaningful life and a good career, and also mental health, well-being, relationships with family and friends. And I don't think those programs do that, but I don't think prison is necessarily set up to do that too.
In the tribes, there are definitely some tribes making a lot of effort. The Lummi, the Yakima, Kalispel, a lot of these nations are really working hard at, for instance, the Lummi had a diving program. And people don't think about how much money and work there is for making sure bridges are working and all that. So you had Lummi reaching out specifically to the brothers and sisters as they came home for that opportunity. Nisqually also has some programs. Squaxin Island has a actual MOU with the DOC, and they've taken very seriously bringing people home in a good way. And then nationwide, I would think that we would need to have a lot more conversations. Some tribes, unfortunately, are guilty of private prison mass incarceration and need to be called on their shit. And then some are doing amazing work. I think that also as people get more educated about prison and what mass incarceration looks like, you are seeing a very slow shift in mentality and understanding and compassion and empathy. And so I'm hoping that we can push that along quicker. And I do want to remind people that Washington State has its problems with the corrections. Go down south. If you have any doubts of the way mass incarceration looks, right, go to Louisiana, see Angola, go to Mississippi, find places where they literally took the slave plantation as it was and just renamed it a prison. That's called Angola. And it has not changed one bit since it was an actual slave plantation. So these are really important things to understand. The Choctaw people need to be held accountable for the prison that they allow atrocities to happen in every day. But we do have a lot of work, and I would say the prison system in the South is horrific, scary.
I think in Angola, when I was there, 4,000 out of 6,000 people are serving life without the possibility of parole, which is that's a regular sentence in some places.
Right.
Although it is one thing, Alabama, for all its horror, has internet in its prisons. I mean, the irony of this, but it is, I think Washington doesn't have that kind of sentencing structure, which is a good thing. Not that we don't need work, but to imagine that life without the possibility of parole is a normal sentence somewhere is just insane.
I'm going to mention something about the licensing too. You're right that a criminal conviction can render you ineligible for certain professional licenses or just vocational licenses like cosmetology. In 2016, I think was the year fairly recently, Washington passed a bill that would allow you to pursue something called a certificate of restoration of opportunity, the ugliest phrase that may be uttered, or a crop. And that crop would allow you to apply for those, and it would remove your the thing that makes you ineligible. The problem with the crop is that it has its biases too. For example, if you've been convicted of a Class A felony, you can't get a crop. And a crop can't be pursued until you've either been out for 2 years or 5 years, depending on where you're at with the type of conviction you have. There is one mechanism, but as with all of these things, any reentry thing, whether it's parole or some sort of condition that you get from the judge, it's another hoop to add on a whole suite of hoops and try to jump through to get you in the position to succeed.
Any other questions?
I guess I wanted to ask, if we know that there is a lot of money that is going into the system, what is it going to take to help redirect that money to go towards healing and education? Like, instead of that, putting even more money into the system, how can we start forcing it to change? And I know that's like an impossible question.
I got an answer for you. No more prisons, which I can't speak to for the white folks or other types of folks out there, but I would like to see the most impacted communities by this mass incarceration have the ability to self-determine for their community members, which means coming up with different systems of justice. Talked a lot about tribes out here, and a lot of tribes have their own justice systems, either inherited from the United States or passed down for centuries, sometimes thousands of years. I'd like that to be where the money goes, and I'd like us to absorb, unfortunately, the harms, not multiply them, because the truth is, I'm from Oakland, California, and I served quite a bit of time when I was young, and it was violent and it was scary where I grew up, and that was a reality. But allowing the state to assume the responsibility for trying to solve that by just making it a more harmful place didn't help. So I'd like our communities to be able and empowered to try to come up with their own solutions without this prison system.
And this is a system, like we said, this is what it was designed to do. So I think that there isn't any possible way that we can work within the system. We have to reject it fully. One of those things means that reparations have to happen. And reparations is going to start to have to happen in mass incarceration issues first. And I think that that is something that a lot of people are struggling to have the conversation around. If you even ask, no offense to white folks in the room, but ask the majority of white folks whether or not they think that there should be cash given. And most white people will go, no. They won't remember Japanese reparations. They won't remember Jewish reparations, but they will damn sure have a reaction to Black people getting money. So we have to really talk about, like, what does that look like? What does deconstructing this entire system look like, really? And we're at a place where most of us, regardless of our ethnic background, are willing to give up the amount of privilege that we have now in order to give it to everybody.
There's a really amazing woman named Mariam Kaba who's doing all this great work with transformative justice, and she's an activist and a writer. But she has a short story called Justice, and it's about envisioning an alternative justice system. It's sort of science fiction, but I really appreciate the work she's doing. We're trying to bring her out to Washington. And then Daniel Surratt, who runs an organization in the Bay Area called Common Justice. I think thinking about where to put money. And it's an organization that does transformative restorative justice practices with people. People always say, well, that's not, you can't scale that. It's too labor intensive. It's too small. But there are if you put the resources to it, you can come up with other systems. And I always think about in Rwanda, they had the Gacaca courts in which people who didn't want to go all the way to Kenya to testify about the genocide there, they had their communities build these community-based justice systems where people had to face the person who had harmed other people had to face who they had harmed, and the community decided what would happen with them because people were living with people who had murdered their families and loved ones and maimed and brutalized them. So I think there are models. We just don't. Danielle Surratt in her book says it's like we live in this desert, and the only thing in the desert is a hamburger stand, and it's a really crappy hamburger stand, but we all just keep going there because it's the only thing we have. But if there were other things there and we started to build other things there, we wouldn't have to go to the crappy hamburger stand. And I think we just used to prisons as the solution. We send people to prison and they don't work. They don't create accountability. They don't create healing. They increase trauma. They increase harm. So there are models, but we just have to take the money from the system as it is. I mean, really, it's a question about capitalism, but that's a separate. Yeah.
Any last questions?
I have a follow-up question, just building off of yours, which is my original question. I guess so then, if we're trying to move towards a world without prisons, what are the type of choices you all are making in still getting folks who are on the inside the education that they want? What type of choices are you making, or maybe there are strategic choices or decisions you're making to get that for them while also still leaving the space for this alternate reality, alternative justice?
I really like Ruth Gilmore's work. She's an abolitionist and has done activism for a long time, and she says abolition is a practice. I think we tend to think of abolition as just getting rid of something, but I think if you think of it as a practice and a vision and a series of strategies, I think you're right. There's a massive contradiction. Do you work in a system that you're trying to dismantle, but can you keep your eye on the horizon and imagine something else and just talking about it, having that conversation that's not just shut down, I think is important. And then giving people, I was at a group and this outside group was talking about abolition. And then the outside group went in and some of the people inside that they were talking to were like, what's abolition? So there is a piece that also making sure that people inside have access to the same information and resources and ideas so that can become a vision or a different vision. So I think education has that space there as a strategy or a tactic, but I don't think it's untainted by the system in any way. And I think if we think of it as a practice, as something that we're building toward, as opposed to just shutting it down, that it's never going to happen or it's unrealistic.
Yeah, I'm starting to notice a new wave in prisoners. They are kind of like doing a self-reform, and it's through culture. And so a lot of ethnic groups are getting together inside, and it's not the racial line thing that the old school prisoner mindset had, but it's a new kind of reform where they're getting together to embrace culture, and they're learning from whatever we can provide as volunteers to take in, because we always get blocked every time we try to bring in cultural artifacts or writings or books and stuff. But so we got to do a lot by just verbal presentation and just trying to instill that knowledge in them, of who they are, where they come from, what their ancestors are like, what their heritage is like, has given them some self-reform, to survive in there, but I've been in and out of the prison system since I was 5 years old. My brother has been incarcerated. He's 60 years old. He's been incarcerated 52 years of his life. In and out of CYA, which is California Youth Authorities, in and out of state prisons in and out of federal prisons. He's been to almost every prison in this country. He's now locked up in Walla Walla. So my experience with visiting him has always been in this kind of a setting, you know, with vending machines and all that. I know the prison system. I grew up going to see him every weekend, and I've seen no reform in him at all. And during all his incarcerations, all I've seen is him come out, reoffend, get worse. But now that he's an older man, starting to embrace his culture, starting to learn about our heritage and where he's from, our ancestors, I'm starting to see the spark in him that he needed all his life, you know. And those are things as people of color, prisoners of color, have had to do to cope.
And in Washington State prisons, for the hoops, the circles, which are tribal, we have white bison recovery, and white bison is available to anyone involved in the hoop. And white bison is a recovery that also focuses on Warrior Down, trauma. It is a certified program through White Bison out of Denver, Colorado. And similar to what Sis is saying is that you can see somebody, you know, that you've seen for 25 years, 12 years, whatever, and all of a sudden they learned how to make regalia and they're going to dance for the very first time. And it is a huge deal. And, you know, they will be nervous and they'll be worried. And on the outside, you know, you would watch somebody and they can't get their footing and they don't know the rhythm, and people would snicker and laugh. And on the inside, it's not like that. We're so proud. We cannot wait. Absolutely. And when they put that first foot down and they kind of look around, man, we're like, it's everything for us. And so I think that being able to be seen and genuinely be seen, and then to know that you're going to come home and regardless of your charge, you're going to be seen, it's huge. I would say where we need to do work is that in my culture, and I can't speak for any other, but in my specific tribe, there are 2 charges that we still struggle with any reconciliation around. And so even though I disagree with that, and I think reconciliation should be available to everybody, I would tell you culturally, I do not stand in the majority for that mindset. And that I've been in places where people will say, as soon as they come home, we better not see them. We better not see them on this island. We better not see them nowhere near nothing. And I think that that's a shame, because then they've been inside getting all of this support and go home and they have none. So, yeah.
So it is time for us to end, but we do have a question for our Facebook Live, which is, what are the needs to support parenting education for parents to help them return to their families?
Fund these organizations. Yeah. These organizations aren't getting any funding. Yeah. We can do a lot. We can do a lot, but please, please, instead of giving to these big, huge organizations that the city is pouring money into, like, consider these people doing ground level work. Think about the person. I can tell you aunties who spend every dime they've got outside of their rent on gas so that they can drive from facility to facility to make the API event, to make the powwow, to do what you're doing. This is all on his dime. Nobody's giving him no money. That is expensive, and it is trauma every time you have to go in, and it's trauma every time you got to say goodbye and get out. And so thinking about, like, if you've got $25 to give, that makes a huge difference. That's a gas card. Please give.
Well, thank you so much to our panelists for coming out and sharing knowledge with us, and thank you for our audience members for participating and listening. We will have a Lunch and Learn next month on July 17th on restorative justice. So we hope to see you all there. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank
You were busy with the judge, so I didn't want to invade the space.